If I had known one wrong turn would change everything, I would have stayed home that morning. The words barely existed in Emily Carter's mind as she stood outside the glass doors of the most expensive restaurant she had ever seen in Chicago, her hands trembling slightly not from fear, but from exhaustion and disbelief. Just 30 minutes earlier, a taxi had splashed through a deep roadside puddle during a sudden turn near the downtown intersection, soaking the lower half of her coat and leaving streaks of mud across her clothes. She had no time to go back, no extra outfit waiting in a closet, no one to call for help. Tonight was supposed to be simple, just a blind date arranged through a well-meaning friend who insisted she deserved a fresh start. Emily adjusted her coat as best as she could, trying to ignore the way people on the sidewalk glanced at her appearance, their expressions shifting in subtle but unmistakable judgment. Inside the restaurant, warm golden lights reflected off polished marble floors, and laughter from well-dressed guests floated through the air like something she did not belong to. Emily Carter had learned long ago how quickly people decided who you were before you ever said a word, and she had survived worse than disapproving stares. She stepped forward anyway. At a corner table near the window sat Daniel Whitmore, a man whose name carried weight in business circles across the country, though Emily did not know that yet. He checked his watch once, then again, his expression controlled but impatient, as if the entire evening had already disappointed him before it truly began. This was supposed to be a formality, nothing more than a scheduled meeting arranged by his assistant who believed he needed to broaden his personal life. Daniel Whitmore had no interest in wasting time, especially not on blind introductions that promised nothing of value. When he finally looked up and saw Emily walking in, he paused, his gaze briefly assessing the situation in a way that was calm but distant. Mud on her shoes, damp strands of hair framing a face that carried both fatigue and quiet determination. He exhaled slowly, already forming the conclusion that this was not going to be a meaningful encounter. Without saying a word, Daniel pushed his chair slightly back, preparing to stand. In his mind, the decision was simple: polite exit, short apology, end of evening. But then something unexpected happened. Emily looked up. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the room, and in that instant, Daniel did not see what he expected to see. There was no embarrassment in her expression, no apology in her posture, only a steady composure that did not match the circumstances at all. It was not dramatic, not loud, but it was enough to interrupt his certainty. His movement slowed. The chair did not move further, and for reasons he could not immediately explain, Daniel Whitmore remained seated. Emily stood near the entrance for a moment longer than she intended, aware that every second felt like it stretched the distance between her and the world inside the restaurant. The polished floor reflected soft light under her shoes, and she carefully avoided stepping too far forward, as if she could somehow make herself smaller in a place designed for people who never had to think about being seen. Daniel Whitmore remained seated, his expression unreadable, but his attention no longer seemed entirely focused on escaping the situation. He watched her with a quiet intensity that he himself did not fully understand. Emily finally took a breath and walked forward, each step measured, steady, refusing to show hesitation even though her heart was racing. When she reached the table, she offered a polite nod, her voice calm as she introduced herself, as if nothing unusual had happened before this moment. Daniel noticed the mud on her coat again, the slight unevenness in her appearance that contrasted sharply with the environment around them. But instead of standing or ending the meeting as he had planned, he gestured toward the empty chair across from him. The motion was subtle, almost automatic, as if some internal decision had overridden his earlier intent. Emily sat down carefully, placing her hands in her lap, and for a few seconds neither of them spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable, but it was heavy with unspoken assumptions and questions neither was ready to ask. Daniel finally broke the silence by asking a simple question about her evening, his tone controlled but noticeably less detached than before. Emily gave a brief explanation about the taxi incident, keeping her tone light, as though it was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. There was no complaint in her voice, no attempt to gain sympathy, only a straightforward honesty that seemed to shift something in Daniel's perception. He listened without interrupting, his earlier assumption beginning to weaken in ways he did not expect. Around them, The restaurant continued its quiet rhythm of conversation and clinking glasses, but their table felt slightly separated from it, as if the space between them had created its own stillness. Daniel asked another question, this time about how she had ended up in Chicago, and Emily answered without hesitation, explaining that she was raising her son alone while working multiple jobs to maintain stability. The way she spoke was neither defensive nor emotional. It was factual, grounded, and calm, as if she had long accepted the reality of her circumstances without letting it define her completely. Daniel observed her carefully, noticing not what she lacked, but what she carried with her despite it all. There was resilience in her tone, a quiet strength that did not demand recognition but made it impossible to ignore. For the first time that evening, Daniel did not check his watch. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, his decision to leave now forgotten, replaced by something far less predictable. The conversation between Emily Carter and Daniel Whitmore continued with a rhythm that neither of them had anticipated when the evening began. Daniel found himself asking questions that were no longer procedural or polite, but increasingly personal in a careful and controlled way, as if testing the boundaries of something he did not fully understand yet. Emily answered each question with steady honesty, never exaggerating her circumstances, never trying to present herself as more or less than what she was. She spoke about working early mornings at a small bakery, then taking evening cleaning shifts at an office building downtown, and returning home late at night to her son, who was waiting for her with questions about his school day. There was no bitterness in her voice, only a quiet acceptance of responsibility that seemed to sit deeply within her life. Daniel listened without interruption, his usual detachment slowly giving way to focused attention. At one point, he realized he had stopped evaluating her as a candidate for a blind date entirely and was instead simply listening to her as a person. That realization unsettled him more than he expected. He was used to conversations having clear purpose, clear outcomes, and clear boundaries, yet this one did not follow any of those structures. Emily, meanwhile, began to notice that Daniel was not reacting in the way she had subconsciously prepared for. She had expected indifference, polite disinterest, or perhaps a quick end to the meeting. Instead, he remained present, his attention steady, his questions thoughtful, and his silence no longer dismissive but reflective. As she spoke about her son, she saw something shift in his expression, subtle but noticeable, as if the idea of responsibility beyond business had touched something personal in him. Daniel asked what her son was like, and for the first time that evening, Emily allowed herself a small smile. She described him as curious, energetic, and kind, someone who asked too many questions and believed the world was always more interesting than it seemed. Her voice softened slightly when she spoke about him, and Daniel noticed the change immediately. It was not just information being shared, it was emotion being revealed without intention. He found himself imagining a life he had never considered closely before, one built not around schedules and boardrooms, but around small, consistent moments that carried meaning in ways numbers never could. Outside the window, the city lights reflected against the glass, and the restaurant continued to move around them, but their table remained still, almost isolated in its own quiet space. Daniel leaned back slightly, processing more than he was expressing, while Emily waited without pressure, as if she had long learned not to expect immediate reactions from people who lived differently than she did. Yet something in the air between them had changed, no longer defined by inconvenience or formality, but by attention that neither of them had planned to give. And for the first time since he had walked into the restaurant, Daniel Whitmore did not think about leaving. The silence that followed did not feel empty, but instead felt like a space where something unspoken was beginning to take shape. Daniel Whitmore remained seated, his posture now more relaxed than it had been at the start of the evening, though his mind was clearly still active behind his calm expression. Emily Carter noticed the shift, but did not comment on it, choosing instead to wait, something she had learned to do in situations where people needed time to reveal their true intentions. Daniel finally broke the pause by asking a question that was no longer casual. He asked whether she had ever considered working in a different environment, something more stable, something that did not require her to constantly move between jobs just to maintain balance. The question was delivered carefully, without judgment, but it carried an underlying curiosity that made it feel more significant than it appeared on the surface. Emily took a moment before responding. She explained that stability had always been her goal, but circumstances often required immediate decisions rather than long-term comfort. She did not complain, nor did she frame her life as unfair. She simply described it as it was. Daniel studied her as she spoke, noticing how she carried responsibility without allowing it to harden her perspective completely. It was a combination he did not often encounter in the circles he moved in, where ambition and comfort usually came at the expense of emotional grounding. As the conversation continued, Daniel found himself asking about her past, not in a probing or intrusive way, but with genuine interest that surprised even him. Emily hesitated briefly before sharing that she had once worked in a corporate office before her son was born, but left after significant changes in her personal life forced her to rebuild from a different starting point. She did not go into dramatic detail, but the simplicity of her explanation made it clear that her decisions had been shaped by necessity rather than choice. Daniel nodded slowly, processing the information in silence. There was something about her resilience that did not align with his initial assumption of fragility. Instead, he saw adaptability, endurance, and a quiet form of intelligence that did not rely on status or presentation. For Emily, the conversation was equally unexpected. She had prepared herself for a brief, impersonal exchange, yet Daniel Whitmore was still sitting across from her, still listening, still asking questions that suggested he was genuinely present. She could not determine his intention, but she could sense that the usual social distance she had come to expect from people like him was not fully in place. At one point, Daniel leaned slightly forward again, his voice lowering just enough to indicate focus as he asked what she wanted for her future, not in terms of survival, but in terms of personal direction. The question caught Emily slightly off guard, not because she did not have an answer, but because she had not been asked in that way for a long time. She looked down briefly, then answered honestly that she wanted stability for her son above all else, and beyond that, she wanted the opportunity to build a life where exhaustion did not define every day. Daniel did not respond immediately. Instead, he seemed to consider her words carefully, as if they had introduced a perspective he had not fully accounted for in his own understanding of success. The distance between them at the table no longer felt like separation, but like a space filled with unspoken recognition, and for reasons neither of them could yet define, neither of them made any move to end the conversation. The conversation had reached a point where neither Emily Carter nor Daniel Whitmore seemed fully aware of how much time had passed since they first sat down. The restaurant around them had shifted subtly as the evening progressed, with fewer guests remaining and the lighting growing slightly warmer and softer. Yet their table remained, unchanged in energy, still engaged in a quiet exchange that felt increasingly natural rather than forced. Daniel leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful, as if weighing the implications of everything he had learned so far. Emily, on the other hand, remained composed, though there was a faint sense of curiosity in her eyes now, as if she had begun to reconsider her initial assumptions about the man sitting across from her. Daniel finally spoke again, his tone calm, but more direct than before, asking what she would do if circumstances were no longer limiting her choices. It was not a question about survival this time, but about possibility. Emily took a slow breath before answering. She admitted that she had stopped thinking in terms of abstract possibilities a long time ago, because her daily responsibilities demanded focus on immediate needs. However, she also shared that if stability were ever guaranteed, she would like to create something meaningful that allowed her to support other people in similar situations, especially single parents trying to rebuild their lives. Her answer was simple, but it carried a depth that Daniel had not expected. He listened carefully, noticing that she did not frame success as personal escape, but rather as collective improvement. That distinction stayed with him longer than he anticipated. Daniel asked a follow-up question, curious whether she had ever pursued that idea in any form. Emily responded that she had considered small steps in that direction, such as helping organize community support groups and offering informal assistance to others at her workplace, but she had never had the resources or time to expand those efforts. As she spoke, Daniel realized that her perspective on ambition was fundamentally different from the environment he came from. In his world, ambition was often measured by expansion, control, and financial growth, while hers was rooted in stability, responsibility, and impact on individual lives. The contrast between those two definitions created a quiet tension in his thoughts. He found himself reassessing not only her circumstances, but also his own assumptions about what value meant in practical terms. Emily, meanwhile, began to notice that Daniel was no longer simply asking questions out of curiosity. His attention had shifted into something more focused, as if he was evaluating ideas rather than just listening to stories. There was no arrogance in his expression, only concentration, which made the interaction feel less like a formal meeting and more like an exchange of perspectives. At one point, Daniel glanced briefly toward the window before returning his gaze to her, as if making a decision internally that he had not yet verbalized. The conversation paused naturally, not due to discomfort, but due to reflection. In that brief silence, both of them seemed to recognize that the evening had already moved far beyond what either had expected when it began, and neither appeared ready to step away from it just yet. The silence that followed their last exchange lingered longer this time, but it no longer felt like uncertainty or hesitation. Instead, it carried the weight of reflection, as if both Emily Carter and Daniel Whitmore were individually processing how far the evening had already moved beyond its original purpose. The restaurant had grown quieter, with only a few tables still occupied, and the soft ambient lighting cast a calm atmosphere that contrasted with the intensity of their conversation. Daniel finally broke the silence, his voice steady but noticeably more thoughtful than earlier in the night. He asked Emily whether she had ever received real support for her ideas, not just encouragement, but actual opportunity to build on them. Emily considered the question carefully before answering. She explained that most of the support she had encountered in her life had been informal, coming from people who understood her struggles but did not have the means to change her circumstances. She described how she often relied on personal determination rather than external assistance, and how that approach had shaped her into someone who valued consistency over risk. Daniel listened closely, his expression remaining composed, but there was a clear shift in how he was interpreting her words. It was no longer about evaluating her situation as an outsider, but about understanding the structure of a life that operated under constraints very different from his own. He asked another question, this time more specific, about whether she had ever considered formalizing her ideas into something larger, such as a structured program or a small initiative. Emily admitted that she had thought about it in passing, but without financial stability or time flexibility, it had always remained an idea rather than a reality. As she spoke, Daniel found himself focusing less on the limitations she described and more on the potential he believed was being left unexplored. There was a clarity in her thinking that did not rely on privilege or resources, but on lived experience, and that distinction quietly shifted the way he assessed her presence across from him. For Emily, the conversation felt unexpectedly balanced. She was no longer being evaluated or judged in the way she had initially feared when she entered the restaurant. Instead, Daniel Whitmore was engaging with her thoughts as if they had tangible value, asking follow-up questions that suggested genuine interest rather than polite obligation. At one point, she noticed him pause mid-sentence, as if something she had said had triggered a deeper consideration he was not yet ready to articulate. Daniel then leaned slightly forward and asked a final question for the moment, whether she would be open to discussing opportunities if they were presented in a structured and realistic way. The question was careful, not impulsive, and it carried no immediate promise, only intent to explore further. Emily did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked at him with quiet attention, sensing that this was no longer a casual conversation between strangers, but the beginning of a decision point neither of them had anticipated when the evening started. The distance between them, both physical and situational, felt less defined than before, and in that uncertainty, the possibility of something new began to form without either of them naming it. Emily Carter remained silent for a few seconds longer than expected, not out of hesitation, but because the question Daniel Whitmore had just asked carried weight that extended beyond the restaurant table. She carefully chose her words, aware that this was no longer a simple conversation between strangers, but something that felt increasingly deliberate. Finally, she responded that she would be open to discussing opportunities, but only if they were realistic, respectful of her responsibilities, and did not compromise her commitment to her son. Her tone was steady, neither defensive nor overly cautious, but grounded in clarity. Daniel nodded once, as if acknowledging not just her answer, but the conditions behind it. He did not respond immediately with proposals or statements. Instead, he leaned back slightly and considered her response with a level of focus that suggested internal calculation rather than casual interest. Emily observed him quietly, noticing that his demeanor had shifted from curiosity to something more structured, as if he was evaluating how her response aligned with possibilities he had not yet fully disclosed. After a brief pause, Daniel spoke again, his voice calm but more intentional than before. He explained that he did not usually extend conversations like this beyond initial introductions, but he also did not often encounter perspectives that challenged his assumptions in such a direct and grounded way. He clarified that if there were to be any further discussion, it would need to be approached with structure, discretion, and clear expectations on both sides. Emily listened carefully, recognizing that while his words were formal, there was no dismissiveness in them. Instead, there was a careful attempt to bridge two very different worlds without forcing either to adjust prematurely. She agreed to continue the conversation under those conditions, emphasizing again that her priority remained stability and responsibility, not disruption of her current life. Daniel acknowledged this without hesitation, and for the first time that evening, a sense of direction seemed to emerge between them, even if undefined. The conversation shifted slightly after that point, moving away from abstract questions and into more practical exchanges about time constraints and availability. Emily explained her schedule in simple terms, outlining her early morning work at the bakery, her afternoon responsibilities, and her evening commitments. Daniel listened attentively, mentally mapping the structure of her daily life in a way that felt more analytical than personal, yet still respectful. He did not interrupt, and when she finished, he asked only one more clarifying question about how flexible her evenings might occasionally be. Emily answered honestly that flexibility was rare, but possible under specific circumstances if planned in advance. That answer seemed to satisfy him for the moment. As the conversation settled, neither of them attempted to force continuation. Instead, there was a mutual recognition that something had been established, even if neither had defined what it was. Daniel glanced briefly at his watch for the first time in a long while, then looked back at Emily with a composed expression that no longer suggested impatience or disengagement. Emily, meanwhile, remained seated with quiet composure, sensing that the evening had shifted into a new phase that neither of them had anticipated when it began, and that whatever came next would not remain confined to this single meeting. The atmosphere at the table had shifted into something more defined, as if both Emily Carter and Daniel Whitmore had quietly accepted that the evening was no longer an accidental encounter, but the beginning of a structured possibility neither of them had planned for. Daniel spoke again after a brief pause, his tone calm and measured, explaining that if they were to proceed with any further discussion, it would not remain informal. He stated that he would have his assistant arrange a properly scheduled meeting within the next few days, depending on Emily's availability, to ensure that any conversation moving forward would respect both her time and responsibilities. Emily listened without interruption, processing the practicality of his approach. There was no pressure in his voice, only clarity, and that distinction mattered more than she initially expected. She responded that a scheduled meeting would be acceptable as long as it could be coordinated around her existing work commitments. Daniel acknowledged this immediately, making a mental note without hesitation. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence felt different from earlier in the evening. It was no longer filled with uncertainty or evaluation, but with the quiet recognition that something had already shifted into motion. Daniel then reached for his phone and, after a short glance, placed it back on the table without using it, as if deciding that the present moment still required his full attention. Emily noticed this small action but did not comment on it, instead focusing on maintaining her composure as she considered how unusual the situation had become. A few minutes later, Daniel spoke again, this time with a slightly softer tone, asking if she had any immediate concerns about participating in a more formal conversation regarding opportunities he might present. Emily took a moment before answering, emphasizing that her only concern was ensuring that her son's routine would not be disrupted. Daniel nodded in understanding, responding that any arrangement would be made with full consideration of her schedule and responsibilities. There was no attempt to override her priorities, only an acknowledgement that they would need to be respected. As the conversation continued, it became less about curiosity and more about alignment, as if both of them were carefully establishing boundaries without explicitly naming them. Emily found herself observing Daniel more closely now, not as a distant figure of authority, but as someone who was deliberately trying to navigate unfamiliar social dynamics without imposing control. Daniel, in turn, seemed increasingly attentive to the structure of her life, not in a way that was intrusive, but in a way that suggested genuine interest in understanding the foundation of her daily reality. When the waiter eventually approached the table to check on them, both of them realized how much time had passed since the beginning of the evening. Daniel handled the interaction briefly and politely, then returned his focus to Emily. There was no urgency to leave now, yet there was also an understanding that the meeting had naturally reached its conclusion for the moment. Daniel stood first, adjusting his jacket with calm precision, and extended a polite acknowledgement that he would follow up through proper channels. Emily also stood, offering a composed response, her tone steady and appreciative of the clarity the conversation had provided. As they exited the restaurant separately, but within the same moment, neither of them spoke further, but the silence between them no longer felt like distance. Instead, it carried the quiet structure of something that had been decided without being fully named. Outside the restaurant, the night air in Chicago felt cooler than Emily Carter expected, brushing lightly against her face as she stepped onto the sidewalk. The city lights reflected off the wet pavement from earlier rain, creating a quiet glow that stretched along the street. Daniel Whitmore exited shortly after her, maintaining a composed distance rather than approaching directly, as if respecting an unspoken boundary between them. For a brief moment, they stood a few feet apart without speaking, both adjusting to the transition from the controlled environment inside to the open space outside. Daniel was the first to break the silence, his tone calm and professional as he confirmed that his assistant would reach out within the next 48 hours to arrange a formal meeting. Emily nodded, acknowledging the plan without hesitation, her expression steady despite the unusual direction her evening had taken. There was no confusion in her response, only acceptance of what had been clearly outlined. Daniel added a final remark, stating that he appreciated her time and perspective, and that he would ensure any further communication remained respectful of her responsibilities. Emily responded briefly, thanking him for the clarity and for the consideration he had shown regarding her schedule. Neither of them extended the conversation further than necessary, yet neither seemed eager to leave immediately either. There was a moment where Daniel looked at her as if considering saying something more, but after a brief pause, he simply offered a polite nod. Emily returned the gesture, maintaining her composed demeanor. Then, without any dramatic movement or final statement, they began to walk in opposite directions. Daniel moved toward the waiting car at the curb, while Emily turned toward the direction of the train station, each step carrying them back into their separate realities. As Emily walked, she replayed parts of the evening in her mind, not with confusion, but with careful reflection. She had expected dismissal, or at most a brief and forgettable interaction, yet what she experienced instead was structured attention, questions that carried weight, and an unusual level of respect for her circumstances. She did not allow herself to assume meaning beyond what had been stated, but she also could not ignore that something unusual had occurred. Daniel, seated in the back of his car moments later, remained silent as the vehicle pulled away from the curb. His expression was thoughtful, his gaze directed out the window at the passing lights of the city. He reviewed the conversation internally, not in emotional terms, but in practical assessment. The encounter had not followed any standard expectation he usually applied to meetings of this nature. Instead, it had introduced variables he had not initially considered, particularly in relation to perspective, resilience, and long-term potential. Neither Emily nor Daniel labeled the evening as significant, yet both carried away the same unspoken recognition that this was not an encounter that would simply end with distance. It had established a connection defined not by emotion or intention, but by structure and curiosity that neither of them fully understood yet. And as the city continued to move around them in separate directions, The beginning of something uncertain but deliberate had already taken shape.